The transport helicopter's engines roared as it descended toward Fort Meridian, but Major Stella Ruiz couldn't hear anything over the pounding of her heart. Through the small window, she watched the familiar concrete buildings and training fields emerge from the Texas heat haze. 4 years. 4 years since she'd last set foot on this base. Since the night that had shattered her world and nearly ended her military career. Her fingers unconsciously traced the small scar above her left eyebrow, a reminder of when she'd hit the barracks floor after Colonel Marcus Webb's fist had connected with her face. But Stella Ruiz was no longer the terrified captain who had fled this place in disgrace. Today, she was returning as the new deputy base commander, second only to the installation's commanding general. And Marcus Webb? He was still here, still wearing his colonel's eagles, still believing he was untouchable. He had no idea what was coming for him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Helicopter touched down with a jarring thud that seemed to shake Stella back to the present. She gathered her gear, straightened her uniform, and stepped out into the blazing Texas sun. The familiar smell of diesel fuel, concrete dust, and military-grade coffee hit her immediately, bringing back a flood of memories she'd spent years trying to suppress. Fort Meridian was exactly as she remembered it. Sprawling military installation that housed nearly 15,000 soldiers across multiple training commands. The same utilitarian buildings, the same endless formations of soldiers moving between facilities, the same sense of barely controlled energy that characterized every major army base. What had changed, however, was Stella herself. At 31, she cut an impressive figure in her Army combat uniform. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her brown eyes held a steely determination that hadn't been there 4 years ago. The silver oak leaves on her collar caught the sunlight as she walked toward the waiting staff car, each step measured and confident. She'd earned those major's insignia through exceptional performance at the Command and General Staff College, 2 combat deployments to Afghanistan, and a reputation for tactical brilliance that had impressed even the most traditional senior officers. Major Ruiz? The young sergeant standing beside the staff car snapped to attention. I'm Sergeant First Class Martinez, your driver and aide. Welcome to Fort Meridian, ma'am. Thank you, Sergeant, Stella replied, her voice steady and professional. I trust you have my schedule? Yes, ma'am. First stop is the headquarters building for your in-briefing with the Chief of Staff. Then a courtesy call with the commanding general at 1400 hours. As they drove through the base, Stella found herself noting changes and improvements. New barracks had been constructed in the housing area, the training facilities had been modernized, and fresh paint covered most of the administrative buildings. But beneath the surface improvements, she could sense that the culture of Fort Meridian remained largely unchanged still, dominated by the old guard of senior officers who viewed the military as their personal kingdom. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, Sergeant Martinez said carefully, have you served here before? You seem familiar with the layout. Stella was quiet for a moment, watching a formation of soldiers conducting physical training in the distance. I was stationed here briefly as a captain, she said finally. 4 years ago. What she didn't tell Martinez was that her previous assignment at Fort Meridian had lasted exactly 6 months and had ended in what the official records called a voluntary transfer for career development opportunities. The truth was far more complicated and infinitely more painful. The headquarters building loomed ahead, a 3-story brick structure that housed the base's senior leadership. As they pulled up to the entrance, Stella could see several officers moving in and out of the building, their conversation stopping momentarily as they noticed the unfamiliar major stepping out of the staff car. Word traveled fast on military bases, and she knew that within hours, everyone would know that the new deputy base commander had arrived. Sergeant, what time is the next all-hands formation? Stella asked as she gathered her briefcase. Every Friday at 0800 hours, ma'am. The entire base turns out for it, usually about 2,000 soldiers in formation. It's mandatory for all personnel, 2,000 soldiers. Stella filed that information away, already beginning to form plans for her first public appearance as the deputy commander. Friday was 3 days away, which would give her enough time to get oriented and prepare for what she knew would be a critical moment in establishing her authority. The Chief of Staff, Colonel Patricia Chun, was waiting in the lobby when Stella entered. A slight woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes, Chun had the bearing of someone who had navigated the complexities of military politics for decades, while maintaining her integrity. Major Ruiz, Chun said, extending her hand. Welcome to Fort Meridian. I've heard excellent things about your work at Fort Bragg. Thank you, ma'am. I'm honored to be here. As they walked toward the elevator, Chun's expression grew more serious. I want you to know that your appointment as deputy commander has generated quite a bit of discussion among the senior staff. At 31, you're unusually young for this position, and there are some who question whether you have sufficient experience for the role. Stella nodded, unsurprised by the revelation. I understand, ma'am. I'm prepared to prove myself through performance rather than credentials. Good attitude, Chun replied as the elevator doors opened. But I should warn you, there are some officers here who have very traditional views about women in leadership positions. They may test you in ways that would be inappropriate, but difficult to prove. The warning sent a chill down Stella's spine, though she kept her expression neutral. I appreciate the heads up, ma'am. I've dealt with similar challenges before. Chun's office was on the 3rd floor, with large windows overlooking the main parade ground where soldiers conducted daily formations. As they settled into chairs around a small conference table, Chun opened a thick briefing folder. Let me give you the situation, she began. Fort Meridian is home to 3 major training commands, 2 support battalions, and a military police unit. Our mission is to train approximately 8,000 soldiers, annually in various specialties ranging from combat arms to logistics. The base runs smoothly from an operational standpoint, but there are some cultural issues that need attention. What kind of cultural issues? Chun hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. There's an old guard of senior officers who resist change, particularly when it comes to integrating women into leadership roles. They pay lip service to official policies, but create informal barriers that make life difficult for female officers. And NCOs, Stella leaned forward slightly. Anyone in particular I should be aware of? Colonel Marcus Webb commands the 3rd Training Battalion, our largest unit, with about 3,000 soldiers. He's been here for almost 6 years and has significant influence among the traditional faction. He's challenging to work with, especially for female officers. The name hit Stella like a physical blow, though she managed to keep her reaction hidden. Marcus Webb, the man who had destroyed her confidence, nearly ended her career, and haunted her dreams for 4 years. He was still here, still in command, still wielding power over the lives and careers of soldiers under his authority. I see, Stella said quietly. What's his reputation among the troops? Mixed, Chun admitted. His soldiers perform well in training, but his leadership style is old-fashioned. There have been complaints about his treatment of female personnel, but nothing that's resulted in formal action. He's careful to stay just within the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Stella's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She knew exactly how careful Marcus Webb could be, how he could make someone's life miserable while maintaining plausible deniability, how he could destroy careers with whispered conversations and unofficial recommendations, how he could make female officers feel isolated and vulnerable without ever leaving fingerprints on his actions. When will I meet Colonel Webb? She asked. He's currently in the field with his battalion conducting a 2-week training exercise. They return tomorrow, and he's scheduled to brief you on Friday morning before the all-hands formation. Friday. Stella realized that her first face-to-face encounter with Marcus Webb in 4 years would happen just hours before she would stand in front of 2,000 soldiers as their new deputy commander. The timing was both terrifying and perfect. It would give her no time to lose her nerve, but also no opportunity to prepare mentally for what was certain to be a difficult confrontation. "Ma'am," Stella said carefully, "I want to be completely transparent with you. I was stationed here 4 years ago as a captain in the 3rd Training Battalion. My experience with Colonel Webb was professionally challenging." Chun's expression sharpened with interest and concern. Challenging in what way? Stella chose her words carefully, knowing that what she said next could have significant implications for her new position. "Colonel Webb and I had fundamental disagreements about leadership philosophy and the role of women in combat positions. Our working relationship became untenable, which ultimately led to my transfer." It was a sanitized version of the truth, one that protected both her privacy and her career. The reality was that Marcus Webb had made her life hell from her first day in his battalion, questioning her every decision, undermining her authority with her soldiers, and making inappropriate comments about her physical appearance and capabilities. The situation had culminated in a late-night encounter in his office, where he had made it clear that her career advancement would depend on her willingness to provide certain considerations that had nothing to do with military competence. When she had refused and attempted to leave, he had grabbed her arm and pushed her against the wall, his intentions unmistakable. In the struggle that followed, she had managed to break free, but not before his fist had connected with her face, sending her crashing into a filing cabinet. The official report had described her injuries as the result of a training accident, and her hasty transfer had been explained as a career development opportunity. Chun studied Stella's face carefully, clearly reading between the lines of her carefully chosen words. "I see. And you feel comfortable working in an environment where Colonel Webb is present." "I'm not the same person I was 4 years ago," Stella replied firmly. "I've learned a great deal about leadership, about standing up for myself, and about the importance of ensuring that all soldiers are treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their gender. I'm confident that I can work professionally with any officer who is willing to do the same. And if Colonel Webb is not willing to work professionally?" Stella's eyes hardened slightly, though her voice remained steady. "Then that will be his problem, not mine. I'm here to do a job, and I intend to do it to the best of my ability. Anyone who interferes with that mission will be dealt with appropriately." Chun nodded slowly, clearly impressed by Stella's composure and determination. "Good. That's exactly the attitude we need. The commanding general specifically requested you for this position because of your reputation for getting results while maintaining high standards. He believes that Fort Meridian needs fresh leadership to address some of the cultural issues we've been dealing with." The briefing continued for another hour, covering everything from base operations to personnel issues to upcoming training schedules. But throughout the discussion, Stella's mind kept returning to Friday morning and her inevitable confrontation with Marcus Webb. 4 years ago, she had been a young captain with more idealism than experience, unprepared for the realities of institutional prejudice and personal corruption. Now she was a seasoned major with combat experience, advanced education, and most importantly, the legal authority to hold senior officers accountable for their actions. As the briefing concluded, and she prepared to leave for her courtesy call with the commanding general, Chun offered one final piece of advice. "Major Ruiz, you have the full support of the senior leadership here. Don't let anyone make you feel like you have to prove yourself beyond what would be expected of any other officer in your position. You've already earned your place here through your performance and potential. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that more than you know." Walking back through the headquarters building, Stella felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread building in her chest. For 4 years, she had dreamed of this moment, the chance to return to Fort Meridian not as a victim, but as a leader with the authority and experience to make real change. Marcus Webb had thought he had broken her, had believed that his actions would drive her from the military entirely. Instead, they had forged her into something stronger, more determined, and infinitely more dangerous to those who abused their power. Tomorrow, Colonel Webb would return from the field with his battalion, expecting to resume his comfortable position as one of Fort Meridian's most influential senior officers. He had no idea that his past was about to catch up with him in the form of a young major who had transformed her trauma into unshakable resolve. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Friday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to cut through even the thick stone walls of the headquarters building. Stella had been awake since 0430 hours, running through her mental preparations for what she knew would be one of the most important days of her military career. She'd spent the previous 2 days meeting with staff officers, reviewing base operations, and carefully observing the dynamics between different units and their commanders. What she'd discovered was both encouraging and deeply troubling. Fort Meridian ran with military precision. Training schedules were met, logistics flowed smoothly, and administrative functions operated without major hiccups. But beneath the surface efficiency, she detected an undercurrent of tension, particularly among the female soldiers and junior officers. Too many conversations stopped when senior male officers approached. Too many promising female NCOs seemed to lack confidence when speaking up in meetings. Too many subtle signs that pointed to a culture where certain behaviors were tolerated as long as they remained invisible. Now, at 0700 hours, Stella sat in her temporary office reviewing Colonel Webb's personnel file one final time. On paper, Marcus Webb appeared to be a model officer. 38 years old, graduated from West Point, multiple deployments, CONSISTENTLY high evaluation reports, and a reputation for producing soldiers who excelled in their military occupational specialties. His 3rd Training Battalion consistently outperformed other units in quantifiable metrics: graduation rates, physical fitness scores, weapons qualifications, and standardized test results. But Stella knew that numbers could lie, especially when they were compiled by people who had learned to fear the consequences of reporting problems. She'd spent her career learning to read between the lines of official reports, to spot the patterns that indicated deeper issues. In Webb's case, there were subtle red flags that most reviewers would miss: a notably high transfer rate among female personnel assigned to his battalion, unusually low retention rates for women completing training under his command, and a pattern of female officers requesting reassignments after brief tenures in his unit. A sharp knock on her door interrupted her analysis. "Ma'am, Colonel Webb is here for his appointment," Sergeant Martinez announced from the outer office. Stella's pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady. "Send him in, Sergeant." She stood and moved to the center of her office, positioning herself behind her desk with clear sight lines to the door. 4 years of advanced training, combat experience, and leadership development had taught her the importance of controlling every aspect of critical encounters. She wore her dress blue uniform, the formal military attire that would remind everyone present of her rank and authority. Her bearing was erect, her expression professional but cold. The door opened, and Marcus Webb stepped into her office. He hadn't changed much in 4 years. Still tall and broad-shouldered, still carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had never faced serious consequences for his actions. His dark hair showed more gray at the temples, and there were new lines around his pale blue eyes, but he remained an imposing figure who dominated most rooms simply by entering them. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing perfect, his expression showing just the right amount of deference for meeting a new superior officer. But when his eyes met Stella's, she saw the exact moment recognition hit him. His composed facade cracked for just an instant surprise, then calculation, then something that might have been concern flickering across his features before he regained control. "Major Ruiz," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he came to attention and rendered a perfect salute. "Colonel Webb reporting, as ordered, ma'am." Stella returned the salute with military precision, her movements crisp and confident. "Colonel Webb, please take a seat." She gestured to the chair positioned directly in front of her desk, a deliberate choice that would force him to look up at her slightly and emphasize the reversal in their power dynamic. As he settled into the chair, she remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, using the psychological advantage of height before taking her own seat. "Colonel, I've been reviewing your battalion's performance metrics," she began, opening a thick folder on her desk. "Impressive numbers across the board. Your soldiers consistently achieve high scores in all evaluated areas." "Thank you, ma'am. The 3rd Training Battalion takes pride in maintaining the highest standards." His voice was steady, professional, but Stella could see the tension in his jaw, the slight stiffness in his posture that suggested he was working harder than usual to maintain his composure. Good. She wanted him off balance, uncertain about her intentions. "Tell me about your leadership philosophy, Colonel. How do you achieve such consistent results?" Webb leaned forward slightly, clearly more comfortable discussing his professional accomplishments. "I believe in discipline, accountability, and clear expectations, ma'am. Soldiers perform best when they understand exactly what's required of them and know that there will be consequences for failure to meet standards." "And how do you handle soldiers who struggle to meet those standards, particularly those who might face unique challenges in a military environment?" The question was carefully phrased, but both of them understood the subtext. Webb's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly as he considered his response. "Every soldier is held to the same standards, ma'am. I don't believe in making accommodations based on gender, background, or personal circumstances. The enemy doesn't care about individual limitations, so neither do I." Stella nodded slowly, making notes in the folder. "Interesting perspective. And what about creating an environment where all soldiers feel comfortable reporting problems or concerns? How do you ensure that information flows freely up the chain of command?" This time, Webb's hesitation was more noticeable. "My door is always open, ma'am. Soldiers know they can bring issues to my attention through proper channels." "Through proper channels," Stella repeated. "And what would you consider proper channels for a soldier who feels they're being harassed or discriminated against?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Webb's facade of professional composure was beginning to show cracks, and Stella could see him struggling to determine how much she knew about his past behavior. "The Army has established procedures for such complaints," he said carefully. "I ensure that all my personnel are aware of those procedures, and that any allegations are handled according to regulation." "According to regulation," Stella echoed again, her tone remaining neutral but her eyes never leaving his face. "Colonel, I want to be very clear about my expectations for your unit and your leadership." She stood and walked around her desk, positioning herself close enough to Webb's chair that he had to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. It was a deliberate invasion of his personal space, a tactic designed to make him uncomfortable and remind him that she now held the power in their relationship. "I expect every soldier under your command to be treated with dignity and respect," she continued, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "I expect female personnel to have the same opportunities for advancement and recognition as their male counterparts. I expect any reports of harassment, discrimination, or inappropriate behavior to be investigated thoroughly and impartially." Webb's jaw was visibly tight now, and she could see a muscle twitching in his cheek. "Of course, ma'am. Those have always been my standards." "Have they?" Stella asked, her tone remaining conversational, but her eyes boring into his. Because my review of your unit's personnel records shows some interesting patterns. High transfer rates among female soldiers. Low retention rates for women completing training. Several informal complaints that were resolved through transfers rather than investigations. Personnel decisions are made based on performance and unit needs, Webb replied, but his voice had taken on a defensive edge. I don't track statistics based on gender. Perhaps you should start, Stella said, returning to her seat but never breaking eye contact. Because I will be. Every promotion, every evaluation, every transfer request that comes out of your battalion will be reviewed to ensure that it reflects fair and equitable treatment. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Webb was clearly trying to determine how much of a threat Stella represented to his established way of operating, while she was equally focused on reading his reactions and planning her next moves. Colonel, she said finally, do you remember? Captain Martinez? She was assigned to your battalion about 18 months ago. Webb's expression remained carefully neutral, but Stella caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Yes, ma'am. Good officer. She transferred to the 82nd Airborne Division for career development. She transferred, Stella repeated, after filing an informal complaint about inappropriate comments regarding her physical appearance and capabilities. Comments that allegedly came from you. That complaint was investigated and found to be unsubstantiated, Webb said quickly. Captain Martinez was clearly struggling with the demands of the position, and her transfer was mutually beneficial. Stella opened another section of the folder on her desk, revealing a different set of documents. I've had some interesting conversations with Captain Martinez and several other former members of your battalion, Colonel. It seems there's a pattern of female officers finding your leadership style challenging. Webb's composure was beginning to crack visibly now. His hands, which had been resting calmly on the arms of his chair, were now gripping the fabric tightly. A flush of color was creeping up his neck, and his breathing had become slightly more rapid. Ma'am, I resent the implication that I treat female soldiers differently than male soldiers, he said, his voice rising slightly. I've served this army for 16 years with distinction, and my record speaks for itself. Your record, Stella said quietly, includes several incidents that raise questions about your judgment and professionalism. Would you like me to be more specific? The challenge hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Webb clearly understood that Stella knew far more about his behavior than he was comfortable with, but he was trapped between admitting wrongdoing and continuing to deny allegations that she obviously had evidence to support. I don't know what you think you know about my leadership, he said finally, his mask of professionalism slipping entirely, but I won't sit here and listen to character assassination based on rumors and disgruntled former subordinates. Stella smiled for the first time since he'd entered her office, but it was a cold expression that never reached her eyes. Character assassination? Colonel, I haven't accused you of anything. I've simply shared my observations about patterns in your unit's personnel actions and mentioned conversations with former soldiers. If you're interpreting that as an attack on your character, perhaps you should examine why. Webb started to respond, then caught himself, clearly realizing that he was walking into a trap. The calculated politician in him was warring with the anger and frustration of being challenged by someone he'd once believed he'd broken. Is there anything else, ma'am? He asked through gritted teeth. Just one more thing, Stella said, standing again and walking back around her desk. In 30 minutes, you and I will be standing in front of 2,000 soldiers for the all-hands formation. They will be watching how we interact, how we treat each other, and what kind of leadership we model for them. She stopped directly in front of his chair, forcing him to look up at her. Those soldiers deserve to see leaders who exemplify the Army values of respect, integrity, and selfless service. They deserve to know that their chain of command will protect them from abuse and ensure they're judged solely on their performance and potential. Can I count on you to help me send that message, Colonel? Webb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. For a moment, he towered over her, and Stella saw something dangerous flash in his eyes, the same predatory look she remembered from 4 years ago. But this time, she didn't flinch or step back. She held his gaze steadily, her own expression calm and confident. "Of course, ma'am," he said finally, though his voice carried an undertone of barely controlled hostility. "Is that all?" "That's all, Colonel. I'll see you at the formation." Webb turned and walked toward the door with rigid, military bearing, but Stella could see the tension in every line of his body. As he reached for the door handle, she spoke again. "Oh, and Colonel, welcome home." The words stopped him dead. He turned back toward her, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. For just a moment, the mask slipped completely, and she saw the real Marcus Webb, the man who used his rank and authority to intimidate those he perceived as weak, who believed his position made him untouchable. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carefully controlled but his eyes blazing. "I said welcome home," Stella repeated, her tone conversational but her meaning unmistakable. "After all, Fort Meridian is where you've built your reputation, where you've established your legacy. I'm sure you're very comfortable here." Webb said nothing, but she could see him processing the implications of her words. He understood now that this wasn't just a routine meeting between a new superior and a subordinate. "Commander." This was a declaration of war, fought with military courtesy and professional language, but no less real for its civilized veneer. Without another word, he left her office, closing the door behind him with just enough force to suggest his true feelings without crossing the line into insubordination. Stella remained standing for several minutes after he left, processing what had just occurred. The confrontation had gone exactly as she'd planned. She'd established her authority, put him on notice that his behavior was being watched, and planted seeds of doubt about how much she knew regarding his past actions. Most importantly, she'd demonstrated that she was no longer the frightened captain he remembered. But she also knew that the real battle was just beginning. In 30 minutes, she would stand before 2,000 soldiers and formally assume her role as their deputy commander. Marcus Webb would be there, watching for any sign of weakness or uncertainty. The entire base would be evaluating her leadership, her competence, and her right to command. 4 years ago, she'd left Fort Meridian in shame and defeat. Today, she would reclaim her place and send a clear message that the culture of intimidation and abuse was about to change. The question was whether Marcus Webb would adapt to the new reality, or force her to take more decisive action. As she prepared to leave for the formation, Stella reflected on how much she'd changed since their last encounter. The scared, isolated captain who had once sat in his office, enduring his threats and intimidation, was gone. In her place stood a seasoned officer with the knowledge, experience, and authority to hold even senior colonels accountable for their actions. Marcus Webb was about to learn that some people don't stay broken. Some people use their scars as armor and their pain as fuel for justice. And some people never, ever forget. The Fort Meridian parade ground stretched out like a vast concrete ocean under the Texas morning sun, its surface already radiating heat despite the early hour. From her position on the reviewing stand, Stella could see the precise formations of soldiers arranging themselves across the field, company after company, falling into perfect alignment, their movements choreographed with the precision that only came from years of military discipline. 2,000 soldiers, 2,000 pairs of eyes that would soon be focused on her as she took her place as their new deputy base commander. But right now, as she watched the final preparations unfold, her attention was fixed on one particular formation, the 3rd Training Battalion, positioned prominently in the center of the field with Colonel Marcus Webb standing at its head. even from a distance. She could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he held himself slightly apart from the other battalion commanders. He was putting on a show of military bearing, but Stella had learned to read the subtle signs of stress and anger. The way he kept adjusting his uniform, the frequency with which he checked his watch, the tightness around his eyes when he thought no one was looking. "Impressive turnout," commented Colonel Chun, moving to stand beside Stella on the reviewing platform. "General Morrison likes to remind everyone that Fort Meridian is a family, and family meetings are mandatory." Stella nodded, still studying the formations below. "How long has Colonel Webb been commanding the 3rd Battalion?" 6 years, Chun replied, following Stella's gaze. "Longest tenure of any current battalion commander. He's very established in his methods." The careful phrasing wasn't lost on Stella. In military speak, established in his methods often meant resistant to change and set in problematic ways. It was diplomatic language for describing someone who had become too comfortable with power and too confident that their position made them untouchable. "Ma'am," Sergeant Martinez approached with a clipboard. "The formation is ready for your inspection. General Morrison will introduce you, then you'll have the opportunity to address the troops." Stella took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settling around her like armor. This wasn't just a ceremonial event, it was her formal assumption of authority, her first opportunity to establish her leadership style, and most importantly, her chance to send a clear message about the changes coming to Fort Meridian. General Morrison, a distinguished man in his mid-50s with a reputation for progressive leadership, stepped to the microphone positioned at the front of the reviewing stand. His voice carried clearly across the parade ground through the base's public address system. "Good morning, Fort Meridian." "Hooah!" The response from 2,000 voices was thunderous, a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very air. "Today marks an important milestone in our installation's history," Morrison continued. "We're joined by our new Deputy Base Commander, Major Stella Ruiz, who brings exceptional experience in combat operations, training development, and personnel leadership to our team." As Morrison outlined her qualifications: combat deployments, advanced education, commendations for tactical innovation, Stella found herself studying the faces in the formation below. Most showed the polite attention expected during formal ceremonies, but she could see genuine curiosity in many expressions. Female soldiers in particular seemed to be watching her with heightened interest, and she understood why. Visible female leadership at the senior level was still uncommon enough to inspire both hope and scrutiny. "Major Ruiz has requested the opportunity to speak with you directly," Morrison concluded. "So without further delay, I present your new Deputy Base Commander." The applause was respectful but measured as Stella stepped forward to the microphone. She took a moment to scan the assembled formations, making eye contact with as many soldiers as possible before she began to speak. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and confident, carrying easily across the parade ground. "Good morning, soldiers of Fort Meridian. Hooah! I stand before you today not just as your new deputy commander, but as someone who understands the challenges you face every day. I've served as an enlisted soldier, a junior officer, and a combat commander. I've made mistakes, learned from them, and been shaped by both my failures and my successes." She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the formation again. "But most importantly, I've learned that true leadership isn't about the rank on your collar or the position you hold. It's about creating an environment where every soldier can reach their full potential, where excellence is recognized and rewarded, and where every member of our team is treated with dignity and respect." The words carried special weight, and she knew that everyone listening, especially those who had served under leaders who failed to live up to those ideals, would understand her meaning. Fort Meridian has a proud tradition of training some of our Army's finest soldiers. The men and women who graduate from our programs go on to serve with distinction around the world, often in the most challenging and dangerous environments our nation can offer. That responsibility, preparing you for success and survival, is one I take very seriously." She shifted her stance slightly, her gaze finding and holding Colonel Webb's position in the formation. But preparation for combat isn't just about technical skills or physical conditioning. It's about developing the moral courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. It's about building teams where every member knows they can count on their battle buddy, regardless of their background, gender, or any other factor that has nothing to do with their ability to fight and win. A murmur of approval rippled through the formation, subtle, but audible enough to suggest her message was resonating with many of the soldiers listening. "Some of you may be wondering about my leadership style, my expectations, or how things might change under my command. Let me be clear. I believe in high standards, accountability, and excellence in everything we do. But I also believe in fairness, transparency, and ensuring that every soldier has the opportunity to succeed." She stepped closer to the microphone, her voice taking on a harder edge. "To the leaders in our formation, NCOs, warrant officers, and commissioned officers, understand that with leadership comes responsibility. You are responsible not just for mission accomplishment, but for the welfare of every soldier under your command. You are responsible for creating an environment where problems can be reported without fear of retaliation, where merit determines advancement, and where our Army values are more than just words on a poster." The silence on the parade ground was complete now. Even the usual background noise of a large military installation seemed muted as 2,000 soldiers absorbed her words. "And to every soldier, regardless of rank or position, you have my commitment that your chain of command will listen to your concerns, investigate your complaints fairly, and take appropriate action when problems are identified. Excellence will be recognized and rewarded. Misconduct will be addressed swiftly and decisively." She could see the impact of her words rippling through the formation. Some soldiers stood a little straighter, while others, particularly some of the senior NCOs and officers, seemed to shift uncomfortably. Most tellingly, she noticed several female soldiers exchanging glances, their expressions showing something that looked very much like hope. Fort Meridian's mission is to train warriors who can fight and win our nation's battles. But we cannot accomplish that mission if we allow toxic behaviors, discrimination, or abuse to undermine unit cohesion and individual performance. Every soldier in this formation deserves to serve in an environment where their contributions are valued and their dignity is protected. The message was crystal clear to anyone who had been paying attention to military culture over the past several years. The Army was in the midst of a long overdue reckoning with issues of harassment, discrimination, and abuse of power. Leaders who failed to adapt to the new reality were finding their careers cut short, while those who embraced change and demonstrated genuine commitment to reform were being rapidly promoted. "I want to close with a challenge," Stella continued, her voice rising slightly. "Look around you. Look at the soldiers standing beside you, in front of you, behind you. These are your battle buddies, your teammates, your brothers and sisters in arms. Every one of them deserves your respect, your support, and your commitment to their success." She paused again, her gaze finding Colonel Webb one more time. "We are one team, with one mission: to train the finest soldiers in the world and ensure they return home safely to their families. Everything we do must support that mission. Anyone whose actions undermine that mission through prejudice, harassment, favoritism, or any other failure of leadership will find that there are consequences." The applause that followed was notably more enthusiastic than her introduction had received. As the sound died down, General Morrison returned to the microphone for closing remarks, but Stella remained at the front of the platform, continuing to observe the formation below. She could see the conversations already beginning. Among groups of soldiers, the animated discussions that suggested her speech had struck a nerve. More importantly, she could see the body language of the various unit commanders and senior NCOs. Reading their reactions like a tactical assessment, most appeared supportive or at least accepting of her message. A few looked genuinely enthusiastic about the promise of change. But several, including Colonel Webb, maintained expressions that could only be described as hostile. As the formation began to disperse, soldiers moving in organized groups back toward their duty stations, Stella noticed something that both pleased and concerned her. Several female soldiers were walking with noticeably more confident postures, their conversations animated and positive. But she also observed that these same soldiers were being watched, carefully and not entirely favorably, by some of their male counterparts and leaders. Change was never easy, especially in institutions as traditional and hierarchical as the military. Her speech had been a declaration of intent, but words alone wouldn't transform Fort Meridian's culture. That would require consistent action, visible consequences for those who resisted change, and unwavering support for those brave enough to report problems. "Strong message," Colonel Chun commented as they prepared to leave the reviewing stand. "You've certainly made your priorities clear." "That was the intent," Stella replied, watching as Colonel Webb dismissed his battalion and began walking toward the headquarters building. "Now we'll see who was listening and who was just hearing words. What's your next step?" Stella smiled, and Chun was surprised by how predatory the expression looked. "I'm going to make myself very visible around the base." Unannounced visits, informal conversations with soldiers at all levels, observation of training exercises. "I want everyone to understand that the new deputy commander is paying attention. And if you encounter resistance, then I'll address it," Stella said simply, appropriately and decisively. As they walked back toward the headquarters building, Stella reflected on how dramatically the morning had unfolded. She had formally announced her presence and authority, established her expectations for leadership behavior, and sent an unmistakable message that the culture of Fort Meridian was about to change. But she also knew that Colonel Webb and others who shared his worldview wouldn't simply accept the new reality without a fight. They had too much invested in the existing system, too much comfort with their established methods of operation. The real test would come when she attempted to translate her words into concrete actions. The formation had been a success, but it was only the beginning. The true battle for Fort Meridian's soul was about to begin, and Stella was prepared for the resistance that would inevitably come. After all, she had learned through bitter experience that lasting change required more than inspiring speeches. It required courage, persistence, and the willingness to confront those who benefited from the status quo. As she entered the headquarters building, passing groups of soldiers still discussing her remarks, Stella felt a familiar sensation building in her chest. It was the same feeling she'd experienced before every major operation. During her combat deployments, a mixture of anticipation, determination, and absolute clarity about what needed to be done. Colonel Marcus Webb had spent 6 years building his empire at Fort Meridian, confident that his position and influence made him untouchable. But empires could fall, especially when they were built on foundations of fear and abuse rather than respect and competence. The war for Fort Meridian's future had begun, and Stella intended to win it. The first signs of organized resistance emerged within 48 hours of Stella's formation speech. It started subtly whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, knowing glances exchanged between certain senior NCOs, and a noticeable coolness from some of the veteran officers during routine meetings. But Stella had learned to read the undercurrents of military politics, and she recognized the pattern immediately. Monday morning brought her first real test when she decided to conduct unannounced visits to various training facilities around the base. Her first stop was the Combat Training Center, where new recruits learned basic infantry tactics. She arrived at 0830 hours, expecting to observe a standard training exercise, but instead found something that made her blood run cold. Listen up. Ladies, Drill Sergeant First Class Kevin Rodriguez was shouting at a group of female recruits who were struggling with a rope climbing exercise. I don't care what the new deputy commander told you about being treated equally. Out here in the real world, you're either strong enough to pull your weight, or you're a liability to your battle buddies. Stella positioned herself where she could observe without being immediately noticed, her jaw tightening as she watched Rodriguez single out the female soldiers for particularly harsh treatment, while ignoring similar struggles among their male counterparts. You think the enemy is going to go easy on you because you're women? Rodriguez continued, his voice dripping with disdain. You think your pretty little speech about dignity and respect is going to stop bullets? This is the Army, not a daycare center. The reference to her formation speech was unmistakable, and Stella realized she was witnessing a deliberate act of defiance. Rodriguez was making it clear that he had no intention of changing his methods, despite her explicit instructions about treating all soldiers with respect. Drill Sergeant Rodriguez, Stella called out, stepping into view. The effect was immediate, and dramatic. Rodriguez snapped to attention while the recruits scrambled to assume proper formation positions. Ma'am. Drill Sergeant Rodriguez conducting physical training with Alpha Company recruits, ma'am. Stella walked slowly around the training area, her eyes taking in every detail. The male recruits looked tired but confident, while many of the female soldiers appeared demoralized and frustrated. Several showed signs of having been singled out for additional criticism. Red faces from excessive exercise, tears hastily wiped away, the defeated posture of people who had been systematically broken down without corresponding efforts to build them back up. Carry on with the training, Drill Sergeant, Stella said quietly. I'm here to observe. What followed was 20 minutes of the most biased instruction Stella had ever witnessed. Rodriguez consistently gave unclear or contradictory directions to female recruits while providing clear, supportive guidance to males. He assigned harder tasks to women while allowing men to skip repetitions. Most telling, he used language and tone that was clearly designed to undermine confidence rather than build it. When the training session ended, and the recruits were dismissed for their next activity, Stella remained behind with Rodriguez and the two other instructors who had been present. Drill Sergeant Rodriguez, walk with me, she said, gesturing toward a private area away from the other instructors. As they moved out of earshot, Stella could see the tension building in Rodriguez's posture. He was a 20-year veteran with multiple deployments and a reputation for producing tough, capable soldiers. He was also, she realized, someone who viewed her new policies as a direct threat to his established methods. Drill Sergeant, tell me about your training philosophy, she began conversationally. Rodriguez straightened slightly, clearly more comfortable discussing his professional approach. Ma'am, I believe in breaking soldiers down and building them back up stronger. The weak ones wash out, and the strong ones become warriors. It's worked for 20 years. And how do you determine who's weak and who's strong? Performance, ma'am. Physical capability, mental toughness, willingness to push through adversity. Stella nodded thoughtfully. What I observed during that training session suggests you've already decided that female recruits are weak before they've had a chance to prove themselves. Is that an accurate assessment? Rodriguez's expression hardened. Ma'am, with respect, I've trained thousands of soldiers. I know what works and what doesn't. Lowering standards to make people feel better doesn't create effective warriors. Who said anything about lowering standards? Stella's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the words. I'm talking about applying the same standards consistently, regardless of gender. What I saw was different expectations, different treatment, and different levels of support based solely on whether someone was male or female. Ma'am, I'm not finished, Stella interrupted, her tone sharpening. What I saw was a senior NCO undermining his chain of command by making deliberate references to policies he disagrees with. What I saw was unprofessional conduct designed to humiliate soldiers rather than train them. Rodriguez's face flushed red, but he maintained his position of attention. Ma'am, my methods produce results. My graduates have some of the highest success rates in advanced training. Your male graduates have high success rates, Stella corrected. Your female graduates have a significantly higher washout rate than the base average, and those who do complete training often request transfers to other units. That suggests a problem with your methods, not with their capabilities. The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge. Rodriguez was clearly struggling between his desire to defend his approach and his understanding that arguing with a superior officer had limits. Drill Sergeant Rodriguez, Stella continued. You have two choices. You can adapt your training methods to comply with my clearly stated expectations about treating all soldiers with dignity and respect, or you can request a transfer to a unit where your current approach is more appreciated. Ma'am, are you relieving me of my position? I'm giving you an opportunity to demonstrate that you can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, Stella replied. But understand that I will be monitoring your training sessions regularly. If I see evidence that you're continuing to treat female soldiers differently than male soldiers, there will be consequences. After dismissing Rodriguez, Stella spent the next hour talking individually with the training instructors and several of the recruits. What she learned was deeply troubling but not surprising. Rodriguez's behavior was part of a broader pattern among certain senior NCOs who viewed her new policies as political correctness rather than military necessity. Her next stop was the military police battalion, where she'd heard rumors of similar resistance to policy changes. Captain Jennifer Haze, the only female company commander in the battalion, had requested a private meeting that Stella suspected would reveal additional problems. Ma'am, thank you for agreeing to see me, Haze said as they settled into chairs in Stella's office later that afternoon. I wanted to discuss some challenges I've been experiencing since your formation speech on Friday. Captain Haze was a 12-year veteran with an exemplary record and a reputation for tactical competence. She was also, Stella noticed, showing signs of stress that suggested she was dealing with significant pressure. What kind of challenges, Captain? Haze hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. Some of the other company commanders have been questioning whether the new policies will affect unit readiness. They've expressed concerns about maintaining standards and ensuring that social issues don't interfere with mission accomplishment. The diplomatic language didn't fool Stella for a moment. And how have these concerns been expressed? Through informal conversations mostly. Comments about how certain people might not understand the realities of military service. Suggestions that experience in conventional units might not translate to understanding special operations or high-intensity training requirements. Stella leaned back in her chair, processing the information. The resistance was more organized than she'd initially realized, with senior leaders coordinating their opposition to her policies through carefully worded critiques that avoided direct insubordination while undermining her authority. Captain Haze, have you personally experienced any retaliation or hostile treatment since my speech? Haze's expression tightened. Not directly, ma'am. But I've noticed that my recommendations for personnel actions are being questioned more. Frequently, my requests for resources are taking longer to process, and I'm being excluded from some informal planning sessions that I would normally attend. It was a classic pattern of institutional resistance, technically following proper procedures while making life difficult through countless small actions that were individually defensible, but collectively devastating to effectiveness and morale. Who specifically has been involved in these discussions about policy concerns? Ma'am, I'd prefer not to name specific individuals unless you're planning to take formal action. These officers haven't technically violated any regulations, and accusing them of coordinated resistance could backfire on both of us. Stella appreciated Haze's political awareness, but the captain's reluctance to provide details also illustrated the effectiveness of the resistance strategy. By keeping their opposition subtle and deniable, the resistors were making it difficult for supporters to speak out without seeming paranoid or accusatory. "Captain, let me ask you a direct question. Do you believe that Colonel Webb is involved in organizing opposition to the new policies?" Hayes was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks of answering honestly. "Ma'am, Colonel Webb has not directly criticized your policies in my presence. However, several of the officers who have been most vocal about their concerns serve in positions where they interact regularly with his staff." It was as close to a direct accusation as Hayes was willing to make, but it confirmed Stella's suspicions. Webb was too smart to openly defy her authority, but he was using his influence and network of relationships to undermine her policies through proxies. "Captain Hayes, I want you to document every instance of unusual treatment, exclusion from meetings, or questionable personnel decisions. Don't confront anyone directly, but keep detailed records of dates, times, and witnesses. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Ma'am, may I ask what you're planning to do about this situation?" Stella smiled grimly. "I'm going to remind certain officers that resistance to lawful orders and policies isn't just unprofessional, it's career-ending. But I need evidence, not suspicions." After Hayes left, Stella spent the evening reviewing personnel files and organizational charts, mapping the relationships between officers who had shown signs of resistance. The pattern that emerged was both predictable and concerning. Most of the opposition centered around a core group of senior officers who had served together for years and shared similar views about women in combat roles. At the center of this network was Colonel Marcus Webb. The next morning brought a test that Stella hadn't anticipated. She was reviewing training schedules when Sergeant Martinez knocked on her office door with an expression that suggested bad news. "Ma'am, there's been an incident at the 3rd Training Battalion. A female recruit has filed a complaint alleging inappropriate conduct by one of her instructors." Stella looked up sharply. "What kind of inappropriate conduct?" "Sexual harassment, ma'am. Inappropriate comments about her physical appearance and suggestions that her training performance could be improved through personal meetings outside of duty hours." The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Just days after her formation speech and her confrontation with Rodriguez, a harassment complaint emerged from Webb's battalion. Either the new policies were encouraging soldiers to report problems they had previously endured in silence, or someone was manufacturing a crisis to test her resolve. "Who's the complainant?" "Private First Class Maria Santos, ma'am. She's been in training for 6 weeks and has an exemplary record." The accused is Staff Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, one of Colonel Webb's senior instructors. Stella felt a cold certainty settling in her stomach. This wasn't a coincidence, it was a challenge. Webb was forcing her to choose between protecting a female soldier and maintaining good relationships with the senior NCO corps. If she pursued the complaint aggressively, she would be accused of overreacting and undermining unit cohesion. If she handled it quietly, she would be seen as hypocritical for not living up to her own stated principles. "Schedule an immediate meeting with Colonel Webb," she ordered. "I want to hear his recommendation for how this should be handled." As Martinez left to arrange the meeting, Stella realized that the real battle for Fort Meridian was just beginning. The formation speech had been the opening move in a complex game of military chess. Now her opponents were making their counter moves, testing her resolve and looking for weaknesses they could exploit. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They were still thinking of her as the frightened captain who had fled 4 years ago, someone who could be intimidated into backing down when faced with institutional pressure. They had no idea that their harassment, their resistance, and their attempts to undermine her authority were only strengthening her resolve. The scared young officer who had once been broken by Colonel Webb's abuse was gone forever. In her place stood a seasoned combat leader who had learned that sometimes the only way to create lasting change was to be willing to fight for it, regardless of the personal cost. The war for Fort Meridian's soul was escalating, and Stella was prepared for whatever came next. The emergency meeting convened at 1400 hours in the base's secure conference room, with only the most essential personnel present. Stella sat at the head of the table, flanked by Colonel Chun and the base's staff judge advocate, Major Lisa Park. Across from them sat Colonel Marcus Webb, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes revealing the satisfaction of someone who believed he held the winning hand. "Colonel Webb," Stella began, her voice professionally calm, "I've reviewed Private Santos's complaint against Staff Sergeant Mitchell. What's your initial assessment?" Webb opened the folder in front of him with deliberate precision. "Ma'am, I've conducted a preliminary investigation into these allegations. Staff Sergeant Mitchell is a 15-year veteran with an exemplary record and multiple commendations for his training expertise. Private Santos is a new recruit who has struggled with the physical demands of our program." The implication was clear, and Stella felt her jaw tighten slightly. Webb was already framing the complaint as a performance issue rather than a harassment case, setting up Santos as an unreliable complainant who might be fabricating allegations to cover her own shortcomings. "What specifically did your preliminary investigation reveal?" Stella asked. "According to Staff Sergeant Mitchell, Private Santos approached him after a particularly challenging training session where she had failed to meet the minimum standards for rope climbing. She asked for additional help, and he offered to provide extra instruction during off-duty hours if she was serious about improving her performance." Webb's tone was matter-of-fact, but Stella could hear the careful construction of his narrative. Every word was chosen to make Mitchell appear helpful and Santos appear as someone who had misinterpreted legitimate training assistance. "And Private Santos's version of events?" Major Park consulted her notes. "Private Santos states that Staff Sergeant Mitchell made comments about her physical appearance during the training session, specifically referring to her fitness level in terms that she considered inappropriate. When she struggled with the rope climb, he allegedly told her that maybe she needed one-on-one motivation, and suggested they meet privately so he could show her the proper technique." The euphemisms were obvious to anyone familiar with harassment patterns, but Webb's expression remained unchanged. "Ma'am, with respect, Private Santos may have misinterpreted Staff Sergeant Mitchell's professional offer of additional training. New recruits often struggle with the transition to military life, and sometimes they misread normal instructor-student interactions." Stella studied Webb's face carefully. He was smooth, experienced at navigating these situations in ways that protected his people, while discrediting complainants. But she had learned to recognize the subtle signs of deception, and something about his presentation felt rehearsed. "Colonel Webb, were there any witnesses to these interactions?" "Unfortunately, no, ma'am. The conversation took place after the other recruits had been dismissed for chow. It's essentially one person's word against another's. Too convenient," Stella thought. Harassment rarely happened in front of witnesses, and experienced predators were careful to isolate their targets. The lack of witnesses didn't prove innocence, it suggested calculation. "Major Park, what does regulation require in a case like this?" The staff judge advocate consulted her manual. "Ma'am, Army Regulation 600-20 requires a thorough investigation of all harassment complaints, regardless of the preliminary assessment. The investigation must be conducted by someone senior to the accused and outside their direct chain of command." Webb's expression flickered slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. "Ma'am, if I may suggest, perhaps this situation could be resolved through counseling and reassignment. Staff Sergeant Mitchell could be moved to a different training company, and Private Santos could be provided with additional support to help her succeed in the program." It was a classic institutional response: make the problem disappear through administrative action while avoiding any formal finding of wrongdoing. Mitchell would face no real consequences. Santos would be tacitly blamed for the situation, and the underlying culture would remain unchanged. "No," Stella said firmly. "We're going to conduct a full investigation according to regulation. Major Park, I want you to personally handle this case. Interview all relevant personnel, review any available documentation, and provide me with a complete report within 7 days." Webb's composure slipped another notch. "Ma'am, with respect, is a full investigation really necessary? These situations can often be resolved more efficiently through command channels." Stella turned to face him directly, her expression hardening. "Colonel Webb, let me be very clear about something. When a soldier reports harassment, we don't resolve it efficiently, we resolve it correctly. We don't make it disappear, we investigate it thoroughly. And we don't protect the reputation of the accused at the expense of the complainant's rights." The room fell silent, except for the soft sound of Major Park taking notes. Webb's jaw was visibly tight now, and Stella could see him struggling to maintain his professional demeanor. "Of course, ma'am," he said finally. "I'll ensure that all relevant personnel are available for interviews." "Good. And Colonel, Staff Sergeant Mitchell is to have no contact with Private Santos or any other members of her training class while this investigation is ongoing. He'll be temporarily reassigned to administrative duties." Webb's eyes flashed with anger. "Ma'am, removing an experienced instructor from training duties will impact our program's effectiveness." "Staff Sergeant Mitchell is one of our best." "Colonel," Stella interrupted, her voice cutting through his objection like a blade. "Are you questioning my decision?" The challenge hung in the air between them, loaded with 4 years of history and the weight of their respective positions. Webb clearly wanted to continue arguing, but doing so would constitute direct insubordination in front of witnesses. "No, ma'am," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll ensure Staff Sergeant Mitchell is reassigned immediately." "Excellent. Major Park, I also want you to review the training records for Private Santos and her entire class. Look for patterns performance, evaluations, disciplinary actions, any indications of differential treatment between male and female recruits." Park nodded, understanding the broader implications of Stella's request. If there was systematic bias in Webb's battalion, the investigation might reveal evidence that extended far beyond a single harassment complaint. After the meeting concluded and the others had left, Stella remained in the conference room with Colonel Chun, who had observed the entire proceedings with increasing interest. "That was well handled," Chun said quietly. "You've made it clear that you're serious about enforcing the new standards." "It was also a declaration of war," Stella replied grimly. "Webb knows I'm not going to sweep problems under the rug to protect his people. He'll escalate his resistance accordingly." "Are you prepared for that escalation?" Stella thought about the question for a moment, considering all the possible ways Webb might respond to this direct challenge to his authority. "Colonel Chun, 4 years ago, I was a captain who let institutional pressure silence me when I should have spoken up. I learned the hard way that predators interpret silence as permission to continue their behavior." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the training areas where hundreds of soldiers were learning the skills they would need to survive in combat. Every one of those soldiers deserved to serve in an environment where their merit determines their treatment, not their gender or their willingness to tolerate abuse. If enforcing that standard means war with the old guard, then that's a war worth fighting. Chun joined her at the window. "You realize that Webb won't stop with passive resistance now. He'll try to undermine you more aggressively." "Let him try," Stella said with quiet confidence. "I've spent 4 years preparing for this confrontation. I know his methods, his weaknesses, and most importantly, I know the regulations better than he does." The next morning brought evidence that Chun's prediction was already coming true. Stella arrived at her office to find a stack of reports on her desk, all documenting minor disciplinary issues, administrative problems, and training deficiencies that had suddenly become urgent priorities, requiring her immediate attention. It was a classic bureaucratic attack. Flood the target with trivial work to prevent them from focusing on important issues. By forcing Stella to spend her time on meaningless paperwork, Webb hoped to limit her ability to pursue the harassment, investigation, and other reform initiatives. But Stella had encountered this tactic before, and she had a simple solution. She called Sergeant Martinez into her office and handed him the entire stack of reports. "Sergeant, I need you to review all of these documents and categorize them by actual urgency. Anything that's been sitting on someone's desk for weeks but suddenly became critical yesterday gets put in the administrative harassment pile. Real problems that require immediate attention go in the actual priority pile." Martinez grinned as he flipped through the first few reports. "Ma'am, I'm betting the administrative harassment pile is going to be significantly larger." "Undoubtedly. For anything in that pile, prepare standard responses acknowledging receipt and indicating that the issues will be addressed according to normal priorities and procedures." It was a polite way of saying that Webb's manufactured crisis reports would be ignored, and that message would be clearly understood by everyone involved. Her next stop was the training area where Private Santos was scheduled for morning physical fitness. Stella wanted to observe the soldier personally, both to assess her credibility and to send a message that complainants would be protected rather than punished for speaking up. What she found was revealing. Santos was a compact, athletic young woman who performed well in most physical activities, but struggled with upper body strength exercises like rope climbing. More importantly, Stella observed how the training instructors interacted with her compared to other soldiers who had similar difficulties. The male recruits who struggled received encouragement, specific technical advice, and patient instruction. Santos received criticism, impatience, and subtle suggestions that maybe she wasn't cut out for military service. The differential treatment was subtle enough to avoid obvious discrimination, but clear enough to create a hostile environment. After the training session, Stella approached Santos privately. The young soldier was clearly nervous about being singled out for attention, especially after filing her complaint. "Private Santos, how are you handling the situation with your complaint?" "Ma'am, I'm trying to focus on my training and not let it distract me from becoming a good soldier." It was exactly the kind of response that Stella had expected: professional, focused, and designed not to cause additional problems. But she could see the stress in Santos's posture and the wariness in her eyes. "Private, I want you to understand something very clearly. You did the right thing by reporting inappropriate behavior. That took courage, and it's the kind of moral strength we need in our leaders. Don't let anyone make you feel like you've done something wrong." Santos's relief was visible. "Thank you, ma'am. Some people have been suggesting that maybe I misunderstood what happened, or that I should have just ignored it." "Who has been suggesting that?" Santos hesitated, clearly torn between honesty and fear of retaliation. "Ma'am, I'd rather not say. I don't want to cause more problems." Stella understood the soldier's position, but the response confirmed her suspicions that there was a coordinated effort to pressure Santos into withdrawing her complaint. It was exactly the kind of institutional intimidation that she had experienced 4 years ago, and it strengthened her resolve to see the investigation through to its conclusion. "Private Santos, if anyone, and I mean anyone, attempts to pressure you about this complaint, I want you to report it immediately. You have my word that there will be no retaliation for speaking up." As she walked back toward the headquarters building, Stella reflected on how the first real test of her leadership was unfolding. The harassment complaint was more than just an individual case. It was a symbol of whether the changes she had announced would be substantive or merely cosmetic. Webb was counting on institutional pressure, bureaucratic obstacles, and social intimidation to make the problem disappear. He believed that if he could discredit Santos and protect Mitchell, he would demonstrate that the new policies were toothless and that the Old ways of handling problems would continue, but Stella had advantages that Webb didn't fully appreciate. She understood his tactics because she had been a victim of them. She knew the regulations better than most officers because she had studied them obsessively after her own traumatic experience. Most importantly, she had the legal authority and moral conviction to follow through on her promises, regardless of the personal cost. The investigation would proceed according to regulation. The evidence would be evaluated objectively, and justice would be served based on facts rather than politics. It was exactly the kind of principled leadership that Fort Meridian needed, and exactly the kind of challenge that would define Stella's entire command. The battle lines were drawn, and the first major engagement was about to begin. The investigation reached its critical phase on Thursday afternoon when Major Park discovered evidence that changed everything. Stella was reviewing quarterly training reports when her office door burst open without the customary knock, and the staff judge advocate entered with an expression of barely controlled fury. "Ma'am, we have a problem," Park announced, setting a digital recorder and several printed transcripts on Stella's desk. A big one. Stella looked up from her paperwork, immediately recognizing the urgency in Park's voice. "What did you find?" "During my interviews with the training staff, I spoke with Specialist Rebecca Torres, one of the administrative clerks in the 3rd Battalion. She mentioned that she had been asked to type up some informal counseling statements for female recruits who were allegedly having attitude problems." Park activated the digital recorder, and Stella heard a young woman's nervous voice filling the office. "I thought it was weird, because usually formal counseling statements go through the company commanders, but Staff Sergeant Mitchell said these were just preliminary documents to help identify problem soldiers before they became bigger issues. He specifically told me not to put them in the official files yet." Stella felt a cold certainty settling in her stomach. "Go on." "When I asked Specialist Torres to show me these documents, she initially refused, saying she had been ordered not to discuss them with anyone. But when I explained that she was legally required to cooperate with the investigation, she agreed to provide copies." Park spread several typed documents across Stella's desk. They were formatted to look like official counseling statements, but contained language that was clearly designed to create a paper trail, justifying adverse actions against female recruits who might cause problems. "Look at this one," Park said, pointing to a document dated just 2 days after Stella's formation speech. "It characterizes Private Santos as having unrealistic expectations about training standards and showing signs of potential disciplinary issues due to adjustment problems." The document was dated 3 days before Santos had filed her harassment complaint. It was a preemptive strike, designed to undermine her credibility if she ever spoke up about inappropriate treatment. "There are similar documents for 6 other female recruits," Park continued. "All dated within days of your policy speech, all characterizing these soldiers as potential problems, despite their actual performance records showing no disciplinary issues." Stella studied the documents with growing anger. The scheme was more sophisticated than she had initially realized. Webb and his subordinates weren't just resisting her policies. They were actively working to discredit female soldiers who might challenge the existing culture. Who authorized these documents? According to Specialist Torres, Staff Sergeant Mitchell brought them to her for typing, but he mentioned that the colonel wanted them prepared in case any of the female recruits started causing problems after the new deputy commander's speech. It was the smoking gun. Stella had been looking for direct evidence that Webb was orchestrating retaliation against potential complainants. But as she read through the documents more carefully, she realized the situation was even worse than she had thought. "Major Park, look at this language. These aren't just character assassinations, they're written to suggest that female recruits are inherently unsuited for military service. They're creating a false narrative that justifies systematic discrimination." Park nodded grimly. "Ma'am, I think we're looking at a coordinated campaign to undermine the integration of women into combat training. This goes way beyond a single Harassment complaint. Before Stella could respond, her secure phone rang. The caller ID showed it was General Morrison, the base commander, and his tone when she answered suggested he was not calling with good news. "Major Ruiz, I need you in my office immediately. We have a situation that requires urgent attention." 15 minutes later, Stella found herself sitting across from General Morrison, who was flanked by the base's command sergeant major and a stern-looking colonel she didn't recognize. "Major Ruiz," Morrison began, "this is Colonel David Sterling from the Inspector General's office. He's here to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your handling of the harassment investigation." Stella felt her pulse quicken, but her voice remained steady. "What kind of concerns, sir?" Colonel Sterling consulted a thick folder before responding. "Major, we've received allegations that you're conducting a biased investigation designed to target specific officers rather than determine the truth about the harassment complaint. Who made these allegations?" "The complaints were filed through appropriate channels by concerned officers who believe that your personal history with certain personnel is affecting your professional judgment." Stella's jaw tightened as she realized what was happening. Webb had escalated his campaign by filing complaints against her, using the Inspector General system to turn the harassment investigation into an investigation of her conduct. "Sir, what specific allegations have been made?" Sterling read from his notes. "First, that you've predetermined the outcome of the investigation based on personal bias rather than evidence. Second, that you've created a hostile work environment for senior NCOs who don't share your political views about women in combat. Third, that you're using your position to settle personal scores rather than serve the best interests of the unit." Each allegation was carefully crafted to sound reasonable while undermining her credibility and authority. By framing her investigation as personal vendetta rather than professional duty, Webb was trying to flip the narrative and make himself the victim. "Sir, I categorically deny all of these allegations. The harassment investigation is being conducted according to regulation by the staff judge advocate, with appropriate oversight and documentation. My decisions have been based solely on professional considerations and regulatory requirements." "Major Ruiz," General Morrison interjected, "I need to ask you directly, is there any personal history between you and Colonel Webb that might affect your judgment in this matter?" It was the question Stella had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. She could lie, minimize the truth, or deflect the question, all of which would protect her career but undermine her integrity. Or she could tell the truth and accept whatever consequences followed. "Yes, sir, there's personal history," she said quietly. 4 years ago, when I was a captain assigned to Colonel Webb's battalion, he sexually assaulted me in his office." The silence that followed was deafening. General Morrison's expression shifted from concern to shock, while Colonel Sterling's bureaucratic composure cracked slightly. "Major," Morrison said carefully, "that's a very serious allegation. Was it reported at the time?" "No, sir. I was young, scared, and convinced that no one would believe me against a respected colonel. I requested a transfer instead and tried to put the incident behind me." "And now you're in a position of authority over Colonel Webb," Sterling observed. "That creates a significant appearance of conflict of interest." Stella met his gaze steadily. "Sir, if I had wanted personal revenge against Colonel Webb, I wouldn't have needed to manufacture a harassment case involving other soldiers. I have the authority to relieve him of command, transfer him, or pursue formal charges based on my own allegations." "Then why haven't you?" Morrison asked. "Because I learned something important during my 4 years away from Fort Meridian, sir. Personal justice matters less than institutional change. If I destroyed Webb's career based on my allegations alone, nothing would change about the culture that enabled his behavior. But if I can prove that he's still engaging in systematic discrimination and retaliation, then his removal becomes part of a larger solution." Sterling made notes as she spoke, his expression unreadable. Major, you understand that your personal involvement in this situation complicates everything. Some would argue that you should have recused yourself from any decisions involving Colonel Webb. Sir, with respect, that argument assumes that victims of assault should be permanently disqualified from positions of authority over their attackers. That's not justice, that's rewarding predators for their behavior. General Morrison leaned back in his chair, clearly weighing the implications of what he had just heard. Major Ruiz, I'm going to ask Colonel Sterling to expand his investigation to include your allegations against Colonel Webb. In the meantime, I need to know, can you continue to function professionally in your current position? Yes, sir. But I want to be clear about something. The harassment investigation will continue according to regulation, regardless of any personal considerations. Private Santos and the other female soldiers deserve justice based on the evidence, not politics. What? Other female soldiers? Sterling asked sharply. Stella realized she had revealed more than she intended, but there was no turning back now. Sir, during the investigation, we discovered evidence of a systematic campaign to discredit female recruits who might report harassment. It appears to be part of a broader effort to resist integration policies. She quickly summarized Major Park's findings about the fabricated counseling statements and the pattern of differential treatment. As she spoke, she could see Sterling's expression growing more serious. Major, if these allegations prove accurate, we're looking at violations of multiple regulations and potentially criminal conduct. Are you prepared to stake your career on these claims? Sir, I've already staked my career on doing what's right rather than what's convenient. The evidence will speak for itself. The meeting concluded with Sterling announcing that he would be conducting a comprehensive investigation of all allegations, both against Webb and against Stella. It was exactly the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that could destroy careers and delay justice indefinitely. But as Stella walked back to her office, she felt a strange sense of relief. For 4 years, she had carried the weight of her assault in silence, allowing shame and fear to shape her decisions. Now the truth was finally in the open, and she could fight her battles without the burden of hidden secrets. Her phone was ringing. When she entered her office, Major Park's voice was excited and urgent. Ma'am, you need to get down to the 3rd Battalion headquarters immediately. Something's happening with Staff Sergeant Mitchell. Stella grabbed her keys and headed for the door, but she paused long enough to call Sergeant Martinez. Sergeant, I need you to secure all files related to the harassment investigation. No one accesses those documents without my direct authorization. Ma'am, is there a problem? There's about to be, Stella replied grimly. And I want to make sure we have all the evidence preserved when the dust settles. The drive to the 3rd Battalion headquarters took only 5 minutes, but Stella's mind was racing through possible scenarios. Webb was under pressure now, with multiple investigations closing in on his operations. Desperate people made unpredictable decisions, and she had learned to expect the unexpected when dealing with cornered predators. What she found when she arrived exceeded even her worst expectations. Staff Sergeant Mitchell was in Colonel Webb's office, shouting loudly enough to be heard through the closed door. Military police were standing in the hallway, clearly uncertain about whether they should intervene in what appeared to be a confrontation between senior leaders. Ma'am, Sergeant First Class Johnson, the MP team leader, approached her with obvious relief. We were called about a disturbance, but we're not sure about our authority to enter a colonel's office. Before Stella could respond, the office door flew open, and Staff Sergeant Mitchell stormed out, his face flushed with anger. When he saw Stella standing in the hallway, his expression shifted to something approaching rage. You, he snarled, pointing an accusatory finger at her. This is all your fault. You and your crusade against real soldiers. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, Stella said calmly, you need to return to your quarters and report to your commanding officer tomorrow morning. I don't take orders from you. Mitchell shouted, taking a step toward her. "You're just another politician in uniform, destroying everything that made this army great." The MPs moved closer, sensing the escalating tension, but Mitchell was beyond rational thought. 4 years of protected behavior had convinced him that he was untouchable, and the sudden threat to his career had shattered his self-control. "You want to destroy careers based on lies from weak soldiers who can't handle real training?" Mitchell continued, his voice rising to near hysteria. "Well, let me tell you something about your precious Private Santos. That's enough." Colonel Webb's voice cut through Mitchell's rant as he emerged from his office. But Stella could see that Webb was struggling to control a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his ability to manage. Mitchell spun around to face his commanding officer. "Sir, you promised me this would be handled quietly. You said the investigation was just for show, that nothing would really happen." The admission hung in the air like a smoking gun. Webb's face went white as he realized that Mitchell had just provided evidence of conspiracy and obstruction of justice in front of multiple witnesses. "Sergeant First Class Johnson," Stella said quietly, "I think Staff Sergeant Mitchell needs to be escorted to the MP's detention facility. He appears to be having a mental health crisis." It was a face-saving formulation that would protect Mitchell from immediate criminal charges while ensuring he couldn't cause additional damage. But as the MPs moved to escort him away, Mitchell made one final catastrophic decision. He lunged toward Stella with his hands outstretched, his face contorted with rage and desperation. "This is all your fault," he screamed. "You destroyed everything." What happened next would be talked about at Fort Meridian for years to come. Mitchell's lunge toward Stella was swift and desperate, driven by 4 years of protected misconduct suddenly crashing down around him. But he had made a critical miscalculation, the frightened captain he thought he remembered no longer existed. Stella's reaction was instantaneous and devastatingly precise. As Mitchell's hands reached for her, she stepped aside with fluid grace, grabbed his extended wrist, and used his own momentum to send him face first into the concrete wall of the hallway. The impact was loud enough to echo through the building, followed immediately by Mitchell's cry of pain as his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. The crack of breaking bone was audible to everyone present. "My arm!" Mitchell screamed, crumpling to the floor while cradling his clearly broken limb. "She broke my arm. Did you see that? She assaulted me." The hallway erupted in controlled chaos. The military police immediately moved to secure the scene while medics were called for Mitchell's injury. But through it all, Stella remained calm and composed, standing over Mitchell's writhing form with the bearing of someone who had just handled a minor inconvenience. "Sergeant First Class Johnson," she said quietly, "I assume you and your team witnessed Staff Sergeant Mitchell's unprovoked assault on a superior officer?" Johnson, who had observed the entire incident with professional interest, nodded firmly. "Yes, ma'am. Staff Sergeant Mitchell made an aggressive move toward you, and you defended yourself with appropriate force. Clear case of assault on a commissioned officer." Colonel Webb stood in his office doorway, his face ashen as he processed what had just occurred. Not only had his key subordinate publicly confessed to conspiracy, but he had then physically attacked the deputy base commander in front of multiple witnesses. The situation had moved far beyond his ability to control or contain. "Colonel Webb," Stella said, turning to face him with an expression of cold professionalism, "I believe Staff Sergeant Mitchell requires medical attention and formal charges for assault on a superior officer. I trust you'll ensure the proper procedures are followed." Webb's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "Of course, ma'am. I'll ensure all appropriate actions are taken." It was a complete capitulation, and everyone present understood its significance. The colonel who had once terrorized subordinates and protected his cronies was now reduced to stammering compliance with orders from the woman he had once assaulted. As the medics arrived and began treating Mitchell's broken arm, Word of the incident spread through Fort Meridian with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Within an hour, every soldier on the base knew that the new deputy commander had single-handedly defended herself against a much larger male, Neko, and left him with a broken arm. But the story that circulated wasn't just about physical prowess, it was about justice finally being served. Private Santos was among the first to hear the news, and she sought out Stella later that afternoon as the deputy commander was reviewing incident reports in her office. "Ma'am," Santos said hesitantly after being granted permission to enter, "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done. When I filed my complaint, I didn't think anyone would really listen or take action." Stella looked up from her paperwork, studying the young soldier's face. Santos looked different than she had just a week ago, more confident, more self-assured, like someone who had been validated rather than victimized. "Private Santos, you don't need to thank me. You did the hard part by speaking up. That took real courage. Ma'am, can I ask you something?" Santos said, moving closer to Stella's desk. "How did you know what to do when Staff Sergeant Mitchell attacked you? That move you used, where did you learn that?" Stella smiled grimly. 4 years of martial arts training, specialized self-defense courses, and the absolute determination never to be a victim again. When someone has hurt you once, you make sure they can never hurt you again. The words carried layers of meaning that Santos seemed to understand intuitively. She nodded slowly, processing the implications of what Stella had shared. "Ma'am, there's something else I wanted to tell you. Since word got out about what happened today, 3 other female soldiers have approached me about problems they've been having with harassment. They want to know if it's really safe to report issues now." Stella's attention sharpened immediately. "What kind of problems?" "Similar things to what I experienced, ma'am. Inappropriate comments, differential treatment, suggestions that complaints would hurt their careers. They've been scared to say anything because they saw what happened to soldiers who spoke up in the past." It was exactly what Stella had expected. Mitchell and Webb's behavior wasn't isolated. It was part of a broader culture of intimidation that had silenced victims for years. Now that the protection had been removed and consequences were being enforced, more soldiers were finding the courage to speak up. "Tell them to come see me directly," Stella instructed. "Each case will be investigated thoroughly and handled according to regulation. And Private Santos, make sure they understand that there will be no retaliation for reporting legitimate complaints." After Santos left, Stella spent the remainder of the afternoon dealing with the administrative aftermath of Mitchell's arrest and the expanding investigation. Colonel Sterling from the Inspector General's office had arrived to interview witnesses, and his preliminary assessment suggested that the evidence supported all of Stella's allegations. More importantly, Mitchell's public breakdown had provided corroborating evidence for the systematic discrimination claims. His admission that Webb had promised the investigation would be handled quietly constituted direct evidence of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. As the sun set over Fort Meridian, Stella received an unexpected visitor. General Morrison knocked on her office door personally, something that rarely happened with senior commanders. "Major Ruiz," Morrison said as he entered, "I wanted to speak with you about today's events." Stella stood and came to attention, but Morrison waved her back to her seat. "This is an informal conversation, Major. I want to understand exactly what happened and what it means for Fort Meridian moving forward." For the next hour, Stella provided a comprehensive briefing on everything she had discovered during her investigation: the systematic discrimination, the fabricated documents, the coordinated resistance to policy changes, and the cultural problems that had enabled years of misconduct. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally asking pointed questions that demonstrated his understanding of the broader implications. "Major," he said finally, "I owe you an apology. When I assigned you to this position, I knew there were cultural issues that needed to be addressed. But I didn't realize how deeply entrenched the problems were. how much personal risk you would face in confronting them. Sir, with respect, addressing these problems is exactly why I'm here. If it had been easy, it would have been fixed years ago. Morrison nodded approvingly. Your handling of this situation has been exemplary. You've followed regulations, maintained professionalism under extreme pressure, and demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership this installation needs. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. Major, I've received preliminary reports from Colonel Sterling's investigation. Based on the evidence collected so far, it appears that your allegations against Colonel Webb and his subordinates are fully substantiated. Stella felt a surge of vindication, but she kept her expression neutral. What happens next, sir? Colonel Webb will be relieved of command pending the completion of the investigation. Staff Sergeant Mitchell will face court-martial proceedings for assault on a commissioned officer and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The entire 3rd Training Battalion will undergo comprehensive review and retraining. It was everything Stella had hoped for, but she knew that administrative actions alone wouldn't solve the underlying cultural problems. Sir, what about the broader issues? The investigation revealed problems that extend beyond just Webb's battalion. Morrison's expression grew serious. That's why I'm here, Major. I'm implementing comprehensive policy changes across the entire installation. Mandatory training on harassment prevention, revised evaluation criteria that include leadership climate assessments, and new reporting procedures that bypass traditional chains of command for sensitive complaints. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. Major Ruiz, there's one more thing. Your performance during this crisis has been noted at the highest levels. When you're ready for your next assignment, you'll have options that most officers can only dream about. After Morrison left, Stella remained in her office as darkness fell over Fort Meridian. Through her window, she could see soldiers moving between buildings, going about their evening routines with the casual confidence of troops who knew their leadership was competent and just. The transformation had been dramatic, but not complete. Cultural change took time, persistent effort, and continued vigilance. But the foundation had been laid, the message had been sent, and the old guard's stranglehold on power had been broken. Her secure phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed it was Major Park, and her tone suggested good news. Ma'am, I wanted to update you on the investigation's final phases. We've identified 12 female soldiers who experienced harassment or discrimination over the past 2 years. All of them are willing to provide formal statements now that they see the command taking their complaints seriously. 12 soldiers. 12 careers that had been damaged by a culture of intimidation and abuse. 12 young women who had served their country with honor while enduring treatment that no soldier should have to face. What about the perpetrators? We've identified 7 NCOs and 3 officers who were involved in various forms of misconduct. Colonel Sterling is recommending administrative action for most of them, with criminal charges for the most serious cases. It was a comprehensive house cleaning that would send shockwaves through Fort Meridian's traditional power structure. But it was also exactly the kind of decisive action needed to demonstrate that the new standards were permanent, not temporary. Major Park, I want you to personally brief each of those 12 soldiers on their rights and the support available to them. Make sure they understand that their courage in speaking up is going to protect countless other soldiers in the future. Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, if I may say so. What you've accomplished here is going to change how the entire Army handles these issues. You've proven that leadership matters more than politics, and that doing what's right is worth any personal cost. As Stella ended the call and prepared to leave for the day, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 2 weeks. She had arrived at Fort Meridian as a competent but relatively unknown major. She was leaving each day as a proven leader who had taken on institutional corruption and emerged victorious. The scared broken captain who had fled this base 4 years ago was gone forever. In her place stood a confident, capable officer who had learned that true strength came not from avoiding conflict, but from facing it with courage and principle. But most importantly, she had learned that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. Sometimes it took years to build the strength, knowledge, and position necessary to confront powerful abusers. But when that moment came, the reckoning was all the more complete for having been so long delayed. Colonel Marcus Webb's reign of terror was over. The culture of intimidation and abuse that he had fostered was crumbling. And the soldiers of Fort Meridian could finally serve with the dignity and respect that every person in uniform deserved. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.